Tell me who deserves your respect, the old man said quietly, and I'll tell you who you really are. The laughter echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Whitmore Aviation Foundation Gala as hundreds of America's wealthiest executives, investors, and public figures gathered beneath the soaring glass ceiling of the Grand Crescent Ballroom in Manhattan. Waiters drifted silently between polished marble columns carrying silver trays of sparkling water and champagne, while a string quartet filled the room with elegant music that almost disguised the sharpness of whispered judgment. Tonight was supposed to celebrate innovation, leadership, and the future of American aviation. Instead, every conversation seemed to circle around one unexpected guest. Claire Whitmore, the brilliant CEO whose company had transformed private aviation into a billion-dollar empire before she turned 35, had arrived not with a senator, not with a celebrity entrepreneur, not with a Wall Street titan, but with a quiet single father wearing a perfectly tailored Navy suit that somehow still couldn't hide the humility in the way he carried himself. Ethan Walker stood beside her with calm blue eyes that revealed nothing, one hand resting gently on the shoulder of his 8-year-old daughter, Abigail, whose silver blue dress made her look like the brightest star in a room full of expensive diamonds. She smiled politely at everyone who looked her way, unaware that many of those smiles disappeared the moment they turned their backs. "That's him," someone whispered near the orchestra. "The pilot." Another voice answered with a laugh. "Not even a commercial captain anymore. Just a contract pilot raising a kid alone." A third voice joined them. "Imagine building a billion-dollar company just to date a man who flies other people's airplanes." The remarks spread through the ballroom like invisible ripples across still water. Ethan heard every word. So did Claire. Neither responded. Claire slipped her hand gently into Ethan's. He squeezed it once before looking down at Abigail instead. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly. Abigail nodded with the quiet confidence only children who are deeply loved possess. "People don't always know the whole story, Daddy." Ethan smiled. "No, they don't." Across the room, Charles Kensington adjusted his tuxedo cuffs before raising his glass high enough for nearby guests to notice. Wealthy, polished, and accustomed to commanding attention, he walked toward Claire with the confidence of a man who believed the room already belonged to him. "Claire," he announced loudly enough for dozens of conversations to pause, "I have to admit, your latest acquisition surprised everyone." A few guests chuckled. Claire's expression never changed. Charles looked directly at Ethan before continuing. "I never imagined the woman who owns one of the most respected aviation companies in America would start dating the man who parks private jets." Laughter rolled across the ballroom, louder this time, sharper this time. Abigail instinctively reached for her father's hand. Ethan simply intertwined his fingers with hers and remained silent. Claire's eyes flashed with disappointment rather than anger. She opened her mouth to answer when the enormous ballroom doors slowly began to swing inward. The music softened. Conversations faded. Every head turned toward the entrance as an elderly man stepped inside with measured confidence, his silver hair catching the glow of the chandeliers. Even the servers stopped moving. Richard Whitmore had arrived, and the moment his eyes landed on Ethan Walker, the color quietly drained from his face. 3 weeks earlier, long before the glittering ballroom filled with whispers and polished smiles, Ethan Walker woke before sunrise in the quiet town of Stowe, Vermont, where mornings arrived with gentle fog rolling across narrow roads and the distant sound of birds greeting another ordinary day. His small white farmhouse sat beside a weathered wooden fence, surrounded by maple trees that had watched countless seasons come and go without ever caring how much money a person made. Inside the modest kitchen, the smell of fresh pancakes drifted through the house, while an old coffee maker hummed softly on the counter. Ethan stood at the stove wearing faded jeans and a simple gray shirt, carefully flipping pancakes into the shape of tiny airplanes because he knew it always made Abigail laugh. She wandered into the kitchen rubbing her sleepy eyes before climbing onto a wooden chair that was just a little too big for her. "Did you make the flying pancakes again?" she asked with a smile that brightened the room more than the morning sunlight pouring through the window. Ethan laughed quietly. "Every great pilot needs a good breakfast before takeoff." Abigail giggled as he placed the plate in front of her. There were no expensive dishes, no luxury appliances, and no household staff waiting nearby. There was only a father doing his best to give his daughter a life built on love instead of appearances. After breakfast, Ethan helped braid Abigail's hair before packing her lunch with a handwritten note tucked inside the paper bag. Every note carried the same reminder in different words. Be kind. Be brave. Be honest. Those things never go out of style. Abigail folded the note carefully and slipped it into her backpack like a treasure. On the drive to school, their aging pickup truck rattled gently over familiar country roads. The heater took several minutes to warm up, but neither of them complained. They sang along with an old country station until the school building came into view. Before climbing out, Abigail looked at her father. Will you be flying today? Ethan nodded. One charter flight this afternoon. She smiled proudly. You always bring people home. Ethan looked at her for a moment before answering. That is the job. He never mentioned the years before charter aviation. He never spoke about uniforms, medals, or missions that could not be discussed. Those memories stayed quietly behind his calm blue eyes, tucked away beside the grief of losing the woman he had loved and the promise he had made to raise Abigail with dignity instead of bitterness. After dropping her off, Ethan drove another 20 miles to the small regional airport where his employer operated a handful of charter aircraft. The hangar was nothing like the glossy corporate terminals featured in travel magazines. Mechanics waved as they worked beneath open engine panels. Pilots carried their own flight bags without assistance. The smell of jet fuel mixed with fresh coffee and cool autumn air. Ethan greeted everyone by name because he believed respect was measured in everyday moments rather than grand speeches. His co-workers admired him, although few knew much about his past. Whenever someone asked why a pilot with his remarkable precision had never pursued a larger airline, Ethan simply smiled and answered, Life gave me someone more important to come home to every night. No one questioned him after that. They only watched as he completed every checklist with quiet discipline, climbed into the cockpit with steady hands, and prepared once again to carry strangers safely through the sky, never imagining that one ordinary flight would soon place him on a course that would quietly change every life waiting beyond the horizon. The afternoon sky over northern New Hampshire had turned the color of brushed steel by the time Ethan Walker completed his final walk around the sleek mid-sized business jet waiting quietly on the ramp. A cold wind swept across the runway, carrying the scent of pine trees and approaching rain while mechanics secured equipment before the weather grew worse. Ethan glanced toward the western horizon where dark clouds gathered with unusual speed. He studied the latest weather briefing without the slightest hint of concern. Years of experience had taught him that fear rarely solved problems, but preparation often did. Inside the small executive terminal, passengers waited with growing impatience as airport employees exchanged nervous looks. One dispatcher hurried toward Ethan holding a tablet. The original pilot called in. He refused the flight because of the storm front moving faster than expected. Ethan accepted the updated flight information with a calm nod. Who was on board? The dispatcher lowered her voice. Claire Whitmore. She has to reach Boston tonight for an emergency board meeting. Apparently delaying is going to cost her company millions. Ethan simply thanked her and continued reviewing every detail before stepping aboard the aircraft. Several minutes later, Claire entered the cabin carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to solving impossible problems before breakfast. Her navy business suit was elegant without appearing flashy, and her expression remained composed despite the tension surrounding the delayed departure. Behind her walked two senior executives speaking rapidly into their phones while an assistant struggled to reorganize an impossible schedule. Claire looked through the open cockpit door. Captain Walker? Ethan turned with a polite smile. Yes, ma'am. She hesitated for a moment before asking, Can we make it safely? Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked once more at the weather display before meeting her eyes. If I believed we could not, this airplane would still be sitting on the ground. There was no arrogance in his voice, only quiet certainty. Claire studied him for another second, then gave a single nod. That is all I needed to hear. Soon the engines came alive with a steady hum that vibrated gently through the cabin. Rain began tapping against the windows as the aircraft rolled toward the runway. The tower cleared them for departure, and Ethan guided the jet smoothly into the gray afternoon sky. Within minutes, the airplane entered thick clouds where occasional turbulence reminded everyone that nature always deserved respect. One executive tightened his seat belt and whispered anxiously, while another stared silently through the small, oval window. Claire remained composed, but her fingers tightened around the folder resting on her lap. Ethan's voice came calmly through the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we may experience a few bumps for the next several minutes. Everything is operating exactly as expected. Please remain seated and let us take care of the rest." His steady tone changed the atmosphere almost immediately. The tension slowly eased. Even the flight attendant smiled with renewed confidence. Nearly 40 minutes later, the aircraft descended through lighter clouds as golden sunlight suddenly broke across the horizon, illuminating Boston Harbor like polished glass. The landing was so smooth that several passengers barely realized the wheels had already touched the runway. As the engines powered down, applause quietly spread through the cabin. Claire waited until everyone had exited before approaching the cockpit. "You stayed calm the entire time," she said. Ethan finished his final checklist before answering. "The people behind this door deserve calm more than they deserve impressive words." Claire smiled for the first time that day. "Most people in my world spend their energy trying to look important." Ethan gathered his flight bag. "The truly important ones usually do not have to." She watched him walk across the rain-soaked ramp without looking back, unaware that the quiet pilot disappearing into the evening would soon become the one person she would trust more than anyone else in her carefully controlled world. Over the following days, Claire Whitmore found herself searching every flight schedule for one name she had never expected to remember. It was not because Ethan Walker had tried to impress her. Quite the opposite. He had treated her exactly as he treated every passenger who stepped aboard his aircraft, with quiet respect, calm professionalism, and a kindness that never asked for recognition. In a world where nearly everyone wanted something from her, Ethan had wanted nothing at all. One crisp Saturday morning, Claire made an unexpected decision. Instead of attending another networking brunch in Boston, she drove nearly 3 hours north to the small regional airport where Ethan was based. The drive carried her through winding country roads lined with brilliant autumn leaves glowing red, orange, and gold beneath a cloudless sky. Luxury sedans rarely visited towns like this, and when Claire stepped out wearing a simple sweater instead of a tailored business suit, almost no one recognized the woman whose face appeared regularly on financial magazines. Ethan was finishing paperwork inside the modest pilot lounge when the receptionist smiled. "Someone is here asking for Captain Walker." Ethan walked into the lobby and stopped for just a moment. "Miss Whitmore." Claire smiled warmly. "Off duty, I hope you will call me Claire." Ethan returned the smile. "Then you should probably call me Ethan." There was an easy silence between them, the kind that never felt uncomfortable. Claire glanced toward the runway where a small training airplane climbed gracefully into the blue sky. "Would you have time for coffee?" Ethan checked his watch. "I have exactly 45 minutes before my next flight." Claire laughed softly. "That sounds more valuable than a dinner reservation in Manhattan." They crossed the street to a family-owned diner where the waitress greeted Ethan by name before placing 2 mugs of fresh coffee on the table without asking. Claire noticed something she rarely witnessed in boardrooms. Every customer who walked through the door smiled at Ethan. The elderly couple near the window waved. A mechanic thanked him for helping jump-start his truck the week before. A young mother quietly thanked him for delivering groceries during a snowstorm last winter. Ethan accepted every word with the same humble nod before changing the conversation back to the other person. Claire watched carefully. None of them cared that he flew airplanes. They respected the man he had chosen to become. "You know everyone," Claire observed. Ethan stirred his coffee slowly. "Small towns have long memories." "Only for good things?" she asked. Ethan smiled gently. "For honest things." Before Claire could reply, the front door burst open and Abigail hurried inside, carrying a drawing folder almost as large as she was. "Daddy." Ethan stood immediately as Abigail wrapped her arms around him. "Miss Harper let us leave early because of teacher conferences." Ethan knelt beside her. "Did you remember to thank her?" Abigail nodded proudly before noticing Claire. "Hello." Claire smiled. "Hello, Abigail. Your father has told me nothing about you, so I think I am already behind." Abigail giggled. "He says the best stories should introduce themselves." Claire laughed with genuine delight. For the first time in years, she forgot to check her phone, forgot quarterly reports, forgot stock prices, and simply listened as father and daughter shared ordinary moments that somehow felt more extraordinary than every gala she had ever attended. As Ethan walked Abigail toward the airport for his afternoon departure, Claire remained standing outside the diner. Beneath the golden afternoon sunlight, she realized she had spent years building an empire that reached across continents. Yet the peaceful life she had just witnessed felt richer than anything money alone could ever create. Without realizing it, her heart had already begun choosing a future her carefully organized world would never willingly accept. Within a week, the quiet friendship that had begun over coffee became impossible to hide. Claire visited the little airport whenever business brought her anywhere near northern New England, and when schedules allowed, Ethan and Abigail would meet her for simple dinners instead of expensive restaurants. They shared homemade pie at the town diner, walked along a lakeside trail where crimson leaves floated across the water, and laughed over Abigail's endless questions about airplanes, business, and whether chief executive officers ever had homework. Claire admitted that some days it certainly felt that way. Those ordinary afternoons slowly became the happiest part of her week. Yet happiness has a way of attracting attention, especially when powerful people believe they have the right to judge someone else's life. It started with a single photograph taken outside the airport. Claire was smiling as Ethan helped Abigail zip her jacket against the chilly Vermont breeze. The picture spread across financial blogs before sunset. By the following morning, television commentators were discussing the personal life of Whitmore Aviation's celebrated chief executive. Some praised her authenticity, but many questioned her judgment. Headlines wondered why one of America's most successful business leaders was spending time with a charter pilot raising a daughter alone. Inside the headquarters of Whitmore Aviation in Boston, conversations became noticeably quieter whenever Claire entered a room. Executives who had once spoken confidently now exchanged cautious glances. During one board meeting, a senior director carefully adjusted his glasses before clearing his throat. "Claire, investors have started asking questions." She remained composed. "About quarterly performance?" He hesitated. "Not exactly." Another executive slid a printed article across the polished conference table. "Public perception matters." Claire glanced at the headline for only a second before folding the paper closed. "Character matters more." The room fell silent. No one challenged her directly, but concern lingered in every expression. Across town, Charles Kensington watched the growing attention with quiet satisfaction. As the wealthy founder of a competing aerospace investment group and someone who had once expected to marry Claire, he viewed Ethan not as a rival in business, but as an embarrassment that needed to disappear. During an exclusive charity luncheon attended by influential investors and reporters, Charles smiled politely while speaking just loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "It is admirable when successful people support local communities," he said. "Although I confess I never imagined dating your pilot counted as community outreach." Several guests laughed into their glasses. One reporter quickly typed the remark into a waiting article. By evening, the quote had spread across social media. Ethan saw none of it until another pilot quietly placed a phone beside him in the airport lounge. "You should probably know what people are saying." Ethan read the article without changing expression. When he finished, he simply returned the phone with a grateful nod. "Thank you." His coworker frowned. "Does that not bother you?" Ethan looked through the hangar doors where Abigail was finishing her homework at a small table while waiting for him to complete his paperwork. Golden sunlight reflected across the aircraft behind her, bathing the entire hangar in warm evening light. "People who only know headlines cannot write my story," he answered softly. Later that night, Abigail looked up from her school notebook after noticing Ethan sitting quietly on the front porch. "Daddy," she asked gently, "why do some people laugh at good people?" Ethan smiled with the same peaceful strength that had carried him through every difficult season of life. "Because sometimes they mistake success for greatness." Abigail rested her head against his shoulder. "What is the difference?" Ethan looked toward the stars beginning to appear above the Vermont mountains. "Success is something the world can give you. Greatness is something you choose every single day, especially when nobody is clapping for you." Neither of them noticed the black luxury sedan parked quietly across the road for just a few moments before driving away, its driver already carrying news that would soon reach the one man whose arrival could change everything. The invitation arrived 2 days later inside a cream-colored envelope embossed with silver lettering that reflected the afternoon sunlight on Ethan Walker's kitchen table. Abigail looked up from her math homework with curious eyes. "Is it another flying job?" she asked. Ethan opened the envelope carefully before reading the elegant card inside. Claire Whitmore requested the pleasure of their company at the Whitmore Aviation Foundation Charity Gala in New York City. Ethan smiled quietly before handing the invitation to Abigail. She read every word slowly before looking back at him. "Does this mean we get to wear fancy clothes?" Ethan laughed softly. "I think it does." Abigail clapped her hands before running upstairs to search for the blue dress she had worn only once the previous Christmas. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away inside Whitmore Aviation headquarters, Claire stood before her executive team as another discussion turned from business to her personal life. One board member folded his hands across the polished conference table. "Claire, you still have time to avoid unnecessary attention." Another executive added carefully, "The gala will include senators, investors, governors, and international partners. Bringing Ethan may create headlines instead of confidence." Claire remained perfectly still before answering. If a company loses confidence because its chief executive respects an honorable man, then the problem is not the man. No one spoke after that. Her decision had already been made. That evening, Claire called Ethan herself. "I know what people are saying," she admitted quietly. "You do not owe me an explanation," Ethan replied. "Perhaps not," Claire answered, "but I owe you honesty. If you come with me, there will be whispers. Some people will smile only because cameras are watching. Others may not hide their opinions at all." Ethan looked through the living room window where Abigail was practicing a school presentation while standing proudly in front of the fireplace. "My daughter has taught me something remarkable," he said. Claire smiled. "What is that?" Ethan answered gently. "She believes kindness is never embarrassing. I have decided she is right." Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment, grateful for the peace in his voice. "Then I would be honored if both of you came." The evening of the gala arrived beneath clear autumn skies as Manhattan sparkled beneath thousands of city lights. Ethan adjusted his dark navy suit in the hotel mirror while helping Abigail straighten the ribbon in her silver blue dress. "Do I look fancy enough?" she asked. Ethan knelt beside her and smiled. "You look like yourself, sweetheart. That is always enough." When they arrived outside the Grand Crescent Ballroom, photographers crowded behind velvet ropes while luxury cars lined the entrance. Claire stepped from her limousine wearing an elegant emerald gown before walking directly toward Ethan instead of waiting beneath the cameras alone. Without hesitation, she reached for his hand. Flashbulbs exploded across the sidewalk. Reporters immediately began shouting questions. "Miss Whitmore, is this your new relationship?" "Captain Walker, how does it feel dating one of the richest women in America?" Ethan answered none of them. He simply opened the ballroom door for Claire before offering his other hand to Abigail. Inside, conversation slowed as hundreds of distinguished guests watched the three of them enter together. Some faces reflected genuine warmth. Others barely disguised their surprise. Across the room, Charles Kensington observed everything with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. He lifted his glass slightly towards several influential guests before beginning to walk in their direction, already preparing the words that would make the room laugh. None of them noticed that another black sedan had just arrived outside, carrying a man whose presence would soon transform every whispered judgment into complete and unforgettable silence. Charles Kensington stopped only a few feet away from Claire, Ethan, and Abigail, raising his crystal glass with the polished confidence of a man who had spent his entire life believing wealth gave him the final word. Several influential investors instinctively drifted closer, sensing that an entertaining exchange was about to unfold. The string quartet continued playing softly in the background, but the conversations surrounding them gradually faded as more guests turned to watch. Charles smiled warmly, although there was little kindness behind it. "Claire," he said smoothly, "I admire your commitment to surprising people. Most chief executive officers bring strategic partners to events like this. You brought your pilot." A ripple of restrained laughter spread through the nearby crowd. Ethan remained perfectly still. Claire's expression never changed. Charles looked toward Ethan with theatrical curiosity. "Tell me, Captain Walker, do you fly her airplane during the week and accompany her to charity galas on weekends?" That is quite an impressive promotion. Another wave of laughter rolled through the ballroom. Abigail tightened her grip around her father's hand, but said nothing. Ethan gently squeezed her fingers before looking down with a reassuring smile. "Remember what we talked about," he whispered softly. Abigail nodded. "Kindness first." Claire stepped forward, her voice calm and unmistakably clear. "Ethan is here because I invited him. That is all the explanation anyone should need." Charles tilted his head with an amused grin. "Of course. I simply worry about appearances. Investors expect stability, not fairy tales." He slowly turned toward the gathering audience. "After all, there is a difference between admiring ordinary people and building your future around them." Several guests shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether to laugh again. Ethan finally spoke, his voice quiet enough that everyone leaned closer to hear. "There is also a difference between judging someone and knowing them." Charles shrugged lightly. "Perhaps, but the world tends to notice titles." Ethan answered with the same steady calm. "Only for a little while." The simplicity of the reply unexpectedly silenced several listeners. Before Charles could answer, Abigail looked up at her father. "Daddy." Ethan lowered his gaze. "Yes, sweetheart." She smiled innocently. "Can I have some lemonade?" Ethan smiled back as though nothing else in the room mattered. "I think that is an excellent idea." He excused himself politely and walked with Abigail toward the refreshment table, leaving behind the tension that continued to hang beneath the glittering chandeliers. Claire watched him go with quiet admiration. He had refused every opportunity to defend himself with anger. He had chosen dignity instead. An elderly woman standing nearby leaned toward Claire and whispered, "That man carries himself like someone who has already won battles none of us can see." Claire smiled softly. "I believe he has." At that very moment, the grand entrance doors opened once again. The room instinctively turned toward the sound. Richard Whitmore entered without announcement, dressed in a classic black tuxedo, walking with measured confidence that came from decades of leadership. Conversations immediately stopped as executives, politicians, and business leaders respectfully stepped aside to greet him. Charles straightened his jacket with visible satisfaction, convinced Richard would surely disapprove of what had unfolded. But as Richard's eyes swept across the ballroom, they passed over the gathered guests, ignored the photographers, overlooked the distinguished dignitaries, and finally settled on Ethan Walker standing quietly beside his daughter at the refreshment table. Richard stopped walking. His face slowly lost every trace of color. His breathing caught almost imperceptibly. Then, barely above a whisper meant only for himself, he spoke words no one nearby expected to hear. "It cannot be. Captain Walker." Richard Whitmore did not speak again for several long seconds. The room watched him with growing curiosity as the billionaire slowly changed direction, leaving behind senators, investors, and corporate leaders who had all expected to greet him first. Instead, he walked directly across the ballroom toward Ethan Walker. The polished marble floor reflected the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, while every quiet footstep seemed louder than the orchestra itself. Ethan looked up as Richard approached. Recognition slowly appeared in his own eyes, followed by the same calm expression he always carried. Abigail looked between the two men without understanding why the entire ballroom had suddenly become so still. Richard stopped only an arm's length away. His voice, usually strong and commanding, carried an unexpected trace of emotion. "Captain Ethan Walker?" Ethan offered a respectful nod. "It has been many years, sir." Richard looked at him in disbelief before shaking his head slowly. "I searched for you." Ethan answered gently. There was no reason to. Claire stood frozen. She had never seen her father speak to anyone with such humility. Charles Kensington frowned in confusion as whispers spread through the crowd. Richard looked around the ballroom before speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "There is every reason." He turned back toward Ethan. 12 years ago, my aircraft suffered a catastrophic systems failure over the Alaska wilderness during a severe winter storm. Visibility was almost gone. We believed we would never make it home. The ballroom fell completely silent. Richard continued without taking his eyes off Ethan. "The military coordinated emergency assistance because our aircraft had entered restricted airspace. A young pilot answered the call. I never saw his face. I only heard his voice through the radio." Ethan lowered his eyes quietly. Richard smiled through unmistakable gratitude. "That voice never left me. Calm. Steady. never once allowing fear to enter the cockpit. Claire covered her mouth with one trembling hand. Richard looked toward the gathered guests. That pilot guided our crew safely through conditions that experienced aviators said were nearly impossible to navigate. Before communication ended, he gave us one final instruction. I have remembered those words every single day since. Richard turned back toward Ethan. Stay with me. I am bringing you home. Ethan smiled softly. I remember. Richard nodded. Because of that man, I watched my daughter grow up. Because of that man, I lived to build the company standing behind me today. Because of that man, I have enjoyed 12 additional years that money could never have purchased. Not a single person moved. Charles slowly lowered his glass. Claire's eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. Abigail looked proudly at her father before whispering, Daddy, was that really you? Ethan gently brushed a loose strand of hair away from her face. I was simply doing my job, sweetheart. Richard shook his head firmly. No, Captain Walker. You were doing far more than that. He slowly faced the crowd, his voice carrying across the magnificent ballroom with quiet authority. Many of you laughed at this man tonight because you measured him by his title instead of his character. You saw a single father. I see the man who gave me more years with my family. You saw an ordinary pilot. I see the finest example of honor I have ever known. The silence that followed was deeper than embarrassment. It was the silence that arrives when pride finally gives way to truth. For several heartbeats, no one spoke. The laughter that had filled the ballroom only minutes earlier had disappeared, replaced by a quiet so complete that even the gentle melody of the string quartet seemed to pause in respect. Charles Kensington stared at the floor, unable to meet Ethan Walker's eyes. Around him, investors, executives, and public officials slowly lowered their glasses, each silently reflecting on how easily they had judged a man whose greatest achievements had never appeared in a newspaper or on a financial report. Richard Whitmore stepped closer until he stood directly in front of Ethan. Then, before anyone could predict what would happen next, the billionaire extended both hands. Captain Walker, he said with sincere humility, I owe you more than my gratitude. I owe you years with my daughter, years with my family, and opportunities that would never have existed without your courage and your character. Thank you. Ethan accepted the handshake with the same quiet grace he had shown all evening. You do not owe me anything, sir. I was fortunate enough to help when someone needed it. Richard smiled. Gently. That answer tells me you have not changed at all. Claire looked at Ethan with tears shining in her eyes, no longer because of the cruel words spoken earlier, but because she finally understood why peace seemed to follow him wherever he went. It had never come from success or recognition. It came from a life built upon quiet dignity. Abigail tugged lightly on her father's sleeve. Daddy. Ethan looked down with his familiar warm smile. Yes, sweetheart. She wrapped both arms around him. I always thought you were my hero. I just did not know everyone else would find out tonight. Ethan hugged her gently. The only thing that has ever mattered is being your dad. Claire stepped beside them and reached for Ethan's hand without hesitation. She did not care about the cameras capturing the moment or the influential guests watching from every corner of the ballroom. I spent years believing leadership meant proving yourself to the world, she said softly. You showed me that real leadership begins with serving people even when nobody is watching. Ethan smiled. Respect is not something we demand. It is something we quietly earn. Richard turned toward the audience one final time. Tonight our foundation planned to honor innovation. Instead, we have been reminded of something far greater. Companies rise and fall. Fortunes grow and disappear. Titles are eventually forgotten. But character leaves a legacy that outlives every balance sheet. One by one, guests throughout the ballroom began to applaud. It was not the loud celebration reserved for celebrities or business victories. It was slower, quieter, and more heartfelt. Even those who had laughed earlier now joined with genuine respect. Charles approached Ethan after a long hesitation. Captain Walker, he said quietly, I judged you without knowing you. I was wrong. Ethan offered a small smile. We all have another chance to choose better tomorrow. Charles nodded gratefully before stepping away, humbled by forgiveness he had not expected to receive. Later that evening, as the lights of Manhattan shimmered beyond the ballroom windows, Ethan, Claire, Abigail, and Richard stood together overlooking the city. No one felt the need to speak. Some moments become unforgettable not because of applause, but because truth finally finds its voice. In the end, the wealthiest man in the room was never the one with the largest fortune. It was the father who chose kindness over pride, humility over recognition, and love over every opportunity to prove himself. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by silence instead of judgment, everyone finally understood that dignity does not ask for attention. It simply waits for the truth to arrive. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of courage, kindness, and second chances, because the people the world overlooks often leave the greatest impact.